Now we welcome to the podcast Mike Gallagher. Mike represents Wisconsin's 8th District in the U.S. House of Representatives and serves in the House Homeland Security Committee and the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Protection Subcommittee. Those are germane to what's going on. He joined the United States Marine Corps and served for 7 years in active duty, rising to the rank of captain. And while earning his bachelor's degree from Princeton University, Mike went on to earn a master's degree in security studies from Georgetown, a second in strategic intelligence from the National Intelligence University, and his PhD in international relations from Georgetown. Given all those accomplishments, you'd think that he'd be about 65 years old. He's not. He's disgustingly young. And apparently he also represents Lambeau Field and is a Minnesota Vikings guy. It's all I can do to keep from just bolting through the screen here. But we're going to get along. We're going to agree on things that are important to everybody. We can argue about football later. Mike, so the pipeline gets taken down, and it appears it was not some devious Bulgarian hackers who typed very quickly, as they do in the movies, and said, "We're in," and then did their devious work. It turns out it may have been something as simple as a phishing attack using a booby picture. You'd like to think that we're hardened against every single one of these things in critical infrastructure, but no, we have companies that are absolutely vital to the national security that seem to have cybersecurity people who are not up to the threat, don't believe the threat is going to hit them, or are we just simply outclassed and outmatched by the legions of hackers out there from China to Bulgaria to Russia to Iran?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on. I think most Americans agree that the Vikings suck, so that's really the foundation for national unity at this point. Although,
did we lose Mike? Did we lose him? I'm sorry. We'll have to get him back next week. That's a big pity.
The Packers are a mess.
Those are
right
polarizing
now,
and divisive remarks.
Yeah, I know the Packers are a mess. You got your own problems over there.
National security can wait. Listen, I have to know.
Aaron Rodgers looks like the guy who's sitting in the back of the car dealership looking at your loan application.
Okay.
All right.
Vince Lombardi was my father's hero. That's how far back the Packers go in this family. The Packers are distinct in this regard, in a number of regards, but in this regard. Instead of being owned by some billionaire family, the Green Bay Packers are owned by the fans. Lots of people have shares in the Green Bay Packers. Do you?
My wife does. And my wife family also has a few season tickets. And I'm not saying that's why I married her, but it was certainly a variable that was considered in the whole process. My dad is he's one of 5 siblings, and I think he's the only one that did not put his kids up in the pipeline for season tickets. So we have to sort of renew the cycle and make sure. We have a 10-month-old daughter.
So you had an abusive father.
Yeah,
I'm so sorry to hear this.
That's right. It's funny. My dad was a physician, but he started a pizza place in Green Bay that still exists to this day. When you guys come to do a live podcast in Green Bay, you can eat at Gallagher's Pizza. Italian food, Irish spirit is a tagline. So when I was young, I got to deliver pizza to the Packer locker room after practice. We would deliver.
Man.
So as a kid, and Favre was still the quarterback, and Favre was my hero. And so I got to deliver pizza to Brett Favre in the locker room. And one time, and this is my greatest accomplishment, Brett Favre asked me for salad dressing. He was getting a salad with his pizza, and he said, hey, Jay, can you give me some French dressing? And I said, sure, Mr. Favre. And I ran over there and ran back and gave him salad dressing. So that's my claim to fame.
Downhill from there, Gallagher. It's all
it's as a Minnesota, it's pure jealousy. It's absolute jealousy, and I can't hide it because you guys play outside. You play the way the Vikings should play, with the flakes coming down on the grass, and the wonderfulness of a small town like Green Bay having their own football team is like Fargo, North Dakota, my hometown, having a space program. I mean, it's just like, why does this town have this? But it's marvelous that you do. And yeah, the rivalry is great, and you're our Yancey Street gang, and I hope you lose every game next season, as much as I admire your town and its fighting spirit.
Enough niceness. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Listen, national security, but on the way to national security, we've got Lambeau Field checked off. You're the chairman of a very important committee. I beg your pardon, the ranking member, unless I've got this completely messed up, but you're the ranking member of a very important committee, which means that the leadership of the House and your colleagues in the Republican caucus think highly of you. And yet you're a Princeton man. Would you just explain this, if you would, please?
How dare you?
How did you get such a big big shot position. Let's put it that way.
I have to correct a record. I think James said I was on the Homeland Security Committee. I was in my freshman year. I am no longer. I'm on Armed Services and T&I, and then I am co-chair of this thing called the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. So basically, we created this special outside commission to examine U.S. cyber policy. And I was the co-chair along with an independent senator from Maine named Angus King. And we had 2 other legislators on it, some outside experts. And just last week, I became ranking member of the Military Personnel Subcommittee on the Armed Services Committee. So I think they're just running out of people at this point. We got so many people that are running for Senate and governor and this and that, or who are getting booted out of office, that I'm failing upward, as it were. But I would say, to connect it to James, your initial question, it was one of the most rewarding things I've done since coming to Congress in 2016 or 2017, more accurately, after the 2016 election. This outside commission, there's actually like a very robust set of literature about the nature of national security commissions and this question of whether they actually make a difference or whether they're just a way for Congress or president to pretend like they're doing something. We actually spent a lot of time at the beginning studying that literature, studying past commissions, and figuring out how we could actually make an impact. And after a year's worth of work, after publishing our report in March of last year, we were actually able to get 25 pieces of legislation passed in the National Defense Authorization Act. It was the biggest cyber legislation in American history. And it was a really rewarding experience. But I fear we're at the beginning of this new domain of geopolitical competition. We're just starting to scratch the surface. And the answer to your question, James, is the fundamental problem is that 80% of the critical infrastructure in cyber is owned by the private sector. So the question is, how do you incentivize the private sector to really take cyber seriously? How do you get the C-suite in all of these companies, particularly public utility companies, to really prioritize cyber? And that's something we spent a lot of time thinking about. I'm not saying we came up with a 100% answer, but we came up with a few ideas.
Is that what the bills did? I mean, what did those bills do, the 25 bills?
So I'll just hone in on a few things. One, if you look back, so we've had Colonial Pipeline, we had Microsoft Exchange, and then we had the SolarWinds hack, right, at the end of the Trump administration going into the Biden administration. One of the things we think would have helped with all three, but particularly with SolarWinds, was it would be giving CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, and DHS, the authority to do something called threat hunting on .gov networks, basically giving them the authority to proactively probe all of our networks for intrusions and vulnerabilities in a way that certain military organizations, Cybercom, have that authority in the .mil space, because CISA is really the entity that is supposed to be the connection to the private sector, particularly connection to private sector companies that operate with critical infrastructure. So that's one thing, basically empowering all the cyber nerds at CISA to be on offense, looking for intrusions into our network, but also funding. They have these things in CISA called the Hunt and Incident Response Teams, which do a lot of this work. We actually need more of them. They need a few more resources. And this is bound up in a bigger thing we tried to do in the commission, which is really elevate and empower CISA so that it is how do I say this? I don't know if maybe I'm not allowed to say this depending on the rating of this podcast. So a sexier place to work, right? In the way where NSA and Cyber Command can compete with some private sector companies, even though their pay sucks comparatively, because the mission is so cool, because people want to be part of that mission. We need the same thing to be true of CISA. And then the final thing I'd draw attention to, and this was a contentious debate, is we created something called the National Cyber Director. The Biden administration actually just nominated one of our commissioners, Chris Inglis, who used to be the deputy at NSA. He's a great guy. And really, we want someone kind of modeled after the U.S. Trade Representative, situated within the White House, who is also proactively reaching out to the private sector and bringing some form of coherence to all the different agencies or sub-agencies that are doing cybersecurity and cyber work.
Mike, Rob wants to come in, but before I let him at you, what happened to the Colonial Pipeline, and why? You said a moment ago the problem is that 80% of the cyber infrastructure is in the hands of the private sector. The CEO of Colonial Pipeline, as best I can tell, has just gone through a catastrophic experience. The humiliation of having to pay off hack. Why isn't all of America, all of the private sector America that owns bits and pieces of the cyber infrastructure, looking at that and saying, fine, we just got our incentive? But what happened?
Yeah, it was hit with a ransomware attack. And my understanding, based purely on I have to be a little bit careful here because we get classified briefings and then we get open source. And so sometimes members of Congress forget which is which. But traditionally, a ransomware attack involves an employee clicking on something that they shouldn't click on. That infects a server, that infects a variety of electronic systems. And then all of a sudden you have an outside entity, in this case, a Russian entity, who has the ability to sort of shut down your whole system and hold it hostage until you pay them money, right? At the most basic level. And I think part of what makes this challenging, and this was an open testimony and conversation I had with General Nakasone last week, is I asked him about sort of the connection between Russian criminal groups and cyber criminal groups and actual Russian state entities, FSB, and other Russian entities. And at times, these connections are so opaque that it's hard for us to know how to respond. And Russia exploits the opacity in order to make it difficult for us to respond. And I've kind of been down the rabbit hole on this. I've seen it in sort of the exquisite, highly classified side. I've seen it in the open source side. And I'll tell you, there are sometimes where we just don't know where, a Russian criminal group begins and the FSB ends, or vice versa, right? And part of the reason, and part of the challenge we have too, and this goes back to SolarWinds. After the SolarWinds hack, basically, if you follow CyberWire, or if you follow some of these cyber podcasts, if you're all interested in cyber and you were following this thing, basically a day later, everyone was talking that about the fact that it was the Russians. It was either Cozy Bear or Fancy Bear, which are these ways we describe different Russian entities. The federal government took much longer to attribute the attack, and much, much longer to actually getting around to sanctioning certain Russian individuals. And that just doesn't work. We need a faster OODA loop in order to have some semblance of deterrence in cyber, where we are willing to quickly attribute and quickly respond. And I get that there has to be an interagency process. And I get that sometimes your response won't be a pure cyber response. And so you got to clear it with Treasury if you're sanctioning somebody, or Commerce. But we just got to be faster, right? And we're just not fast enough right now, in part because the bureaucracy is so fragmented. And then in this case, the federal government was sitting there trying to work with Colonial Pipeline, but my understanding is the CEO just pulled the trigger and paid the ransom, in part because the economic pain that so many Americans were feeling.
Peter,
that makes sense.
Yeah.
By the way, it's interesting to me. My staff had sent me like a rundown of what we're going to be talking about, and it's all about like the debt in Congress. And I didn't know we were going to be talking about cyber, but that's better. I mean, cyber is interesting.
Well, I mean, since you brought up the debt and Congress, we're going to spend, I don't know, $900,000 trillion on infrastructure.
That's right.
How much of that $900,000 trillion that we're going to spend are going to solve this problem? This is cyber infrastructure. That's the first two words in CISA. Yeah. I mean, in a year from now, are we going to say, hey, listen, we threw some money at it. It's going to be better now.
Yeah, I think there's going to be certain money invested. So, for example, the national cyber director I mentioned, we're going to have to invest some money to empower that person with a staff that can be effective. Every big private sector company is having to spend a lot more money on cybersecurity. But I think what makes this really challenging, and why throwing more money at it is ultimately a futile strategy, is that the attack surface in cyber just continues to get bigger and bigger and bigger. I mean, what have we done for the last year, right? We've all spent all our time on Zoom and everyone's working from home. And so we just 10x the attack surface in cyber. So I just think resources, particularly those filtered through the federal government, are just never going to be adequate to keep up with that. Technology.
The other side of it.
Yeah.
So the other side of it, there's the sort of the law enforcement side, which you could describe as sort of, slow. How do you tighten that loop? I mean, it seems to me that as long as the ultimate actor, or as long as the trail of, clues goes back to Moscow, that's going to complicate everything. If it's a pirate living somewhere off the coast of Ethiopia, but you can figure that out. But if it's a state-sponsored cyber attack, how do you get a president and an administration and a national security apparatus to to respond quickly to that, let alone anything even worse.
One of the things that we tried to build off of, basically the Trump administration, the Department of Defense came up with this concept for cyber, which is called Defend Forward. And in many ways, it parallels sort of a pillar of old school deterrence, as we think about it in a Cold War context, which is you need to be forward deployed, engaged in concert with our allies in order to respond to small problems before they devolve into major crises, right? And the same is true in cyber, even though we're talking about something that doesn't fall neatly along geographic lines. But in some cases, yes, you physically need to be forward, working in concert with our closest allies, some of whom are the victims of Russian cyber hacking or CCP cyber hacking and attacks every single day, in order to coordinate a very quick response. And so Cyber Command and NSA have done a really good job of trying to enhance those partnerships, do a better job of sharing intelligence with our allies, particularly our Five Eyes allies. But it's very difficult. It's very difficult. One of the things we advocate for in the final report is a clearer declaratory policy, sort of clarifying the threshold of what constitutes use of force, sub-use of force, and laying out how we might respond, while giving the executive branch some freedom to maneuver depending on the specific attack. But in my mind, the parallel with conventional deterrence, and certainly strategic nuclear deterrence in the old Cold War, is a very imperfect one. Some fundamentals obtain, which is deterrence is really, there's sort of two elements of it, right? Punishment and denial. So punishment is still important in a cyber context. You have to be willing to hit back every time someone hacks your network or attacks you, particularly if that results in physical destruction. And part of the reason I think we haven't seen a more robust set of punishing responses, because really Colonial Pipeline gets at the edge of physical destruction, right? We've seen some cyber attack leading to physical destruction and death in Ukraine, but not necessarily in the American context, and thankfully no loss of life. But once we start to see that, people are going to get pissed and demand a more robust set of punishment. But we got to start quickly responding now. But the bigger part is denial. How do you take that massive attack surface and make it very hard for our adversaries to mess with us? And that ends up becoming, how do I describe this? I'm sorry to go on.
I was going to say that the difference is that if a foreign sponsored terrorist entity blows up buildings in New York and the Pentagon, and we all have to take off our shoes and put our little bottles of shampoo in a plastic bag for the next 20 years.
Yeah.
A foreign sponsored terrorist entity essentially blows up a pipeline. I mean, nobody got hurt and there was no explosion, but it blew up a pipeline.
Totally. Important
pipeline for the Eastern Seaboard. And I don't know who the Osama bin Laden is here. And is it because because that information is known and it's not public, or is it because there's this kind of, which I think it feels like, if you were watching this on the news, it feels like this kind of shrugging, well, gosh, I hope it doesn't happen again. Even though look, I drove to full disclosure, I went from New York City down to New Orleans. I'm in New Orleans now. I did it on Saturday and Sunday. A few days after the pipeline was running again, and I had no trouble getting gas. There was plenty of gas. There was plenty of regular. There wasn't that much, high test. But it seems to me like one of the ways you deter people is you act as a country
the word
to defend
Rob,
the national security act. Go ahead. Sorry.
The word Rob is looking for is you kill them.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, that's
Rob,
the part that's part of the punishment here, isn't it? I mean, you can forward deploy all kinds of assets and embed all little kinds of things. You can maybe slip through a back door and trigger them if they do something stupid. But the other part of it is, if Russia is behind this, and as you just said, that there's going to be those opaque connections between the government and the hackers, is you send in Delta Force to take these guys out. Because if you have 2 or 3 teams of hackers that hit American infrastructure and they all end up dead, there's a message sent there. Yeah. And I know that I can't ask you to speak to what our special forces are doing in this respect, but it seems like that's got to be part of your whole robust package of options there.
Or even worse, you take them from some training camp in Siberia and bring them to Viking Stadium and force them to suffer through that.
Oh, well, that's cruel. That's like
also, Rob, you won't need gas. You won't need gas when we give you an electric vehicle in this infrastructure.
That's right. Package. Right. The $77 trillion. Right. I guess what I'm saying is, just got to get political for a minute. I mean, we spent 4 years saying that the Russians, messed with an election.
Yeah.
Which they didn't do. And now we're pretty sure they messed with an actual pipeline. And our response for the first was this insane breakdown of American politics. And our response to the second is to kind of like, oh, nothing to see here. Let's move along.
An economic slap on the wrist, followed by, and I link these things in my mind, allowing the Nord Stream 2 deal to go with Germany, right? So I think that this gets to the problem, right? Whether it's Russia cyber malfeasance or Chinese Communist Party cyber malfeasance, they all get subordinated to the broader policy goals, right? And so with Russia, it's too early to tell, but I think it's fair to say, at least in the early stages, the Biden administration is taking a very, I'm not going to say accommodationist approach to Russia, but not yet prepared to push back aggressively. And the irony of the Trump administration's approach, after 4 years of the media hyperventilating about how Trump was a Russian asset, was if you actually examine the policy and perhaps try and separate some of the Trump himself rhetorical flourishes with Putin, it was actually quite tough, right? And we started to identify Russian cyber intrusion and hit back. There's a bunch of Marines that are going to drink for free for the rest of their lives because they killed a bunch of Russian guys in Eastern Syria. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And then similarly with China, I think the Biden administration has this tension between, there are certainly some people in the administration that have a realistic view of the Chinese Communist Party and recognize that we're not going back to the status quo ante of, we can all get along and we can integrate them into the global economy and sing kumbaya. But then there's the climate change camp led by John Kerry, who very much believes that we have to cooperate with the CCP because of climate change. And those two things don't add up. And if that camp is ascendant, I think naturally there'll be this tendency to shrug off Chinese cyber hacking. And then you go back to 2015 when, we all learned that the CCP hacked the OPM system. Obama brought Xi to the White House and had a 21 gun salute and a fancy dinner. And they claimed to have made this sort of cyber pact, but it wasn't worth the paper it was printed on, and the Chinese have violated it every day since. So I don't know if that makes sense. I think it's
Mike. Could I just ask a closing question that sort of wraps up the point you're making there? Set aside the current administration. Set aside the politics of it. You began by saying it's difficult for us to know where criminal organizations in Russia end and where the FSB begins. Suppose I said to you, who cares?
Yeah.
Let Vladimir Putin figure it out. He's
right.
responsible for the rule of law in his country. So the question is simply this. If we had an administration that said, that's your problem, and we are placing sanctions on you and your top guys right now, we're reinstating the Trump sanctions and we're going to up the ante. You figure it out. Would that work?
I think it would work better than what we're doing now, which is a whole lot of nothing. I mean, I think the costs that need to be imposed are on Putin and his cronies.
Okay,
right?
That's what it comes down to.
Yeah, in my opinion. And I'm not a Russia specialist. I'm a recovering Arabist who knows very little about the rest of the world. But I don't know. I think, Peter, before we started recording, I fanboyed out on you because I'm a big fan of uncommon knowledge. And,
well, it's nice having you.
Yeah,
we all got to run now.
Hey, turn off Rob's microphone.
You had my good friend Matt Pottinger, who I served in the Marine Corps with.
Oh, you did?
I took over his team in 2007 in Western Iraq.
You probably had a lot of remedial work to do.
Yeah, exactly. Well, at the time, I was sort of laughing at him because I had studied Arabic in the Middle East. I'm like, why'd you waste your time on Mandarin in China? No one cares about that. The Middle East is where it's at. He was right. I was wrong. And then I worked for H.R. McMaster, and you had them both on together. And I think you referenced a Kennan quote at the end of it that I tasked my staff with finding, because Kennan's a Wisconsinite, by the way. He's from Milwaukee. So we won the Cold War. Wisconsin won the Cold War. But if I remind me what it was, because what I took away from it was, this is a huge challenge, but in some ways it's like a privilege, because we have a chance to rise to this challenge. And for whatever reason, we are now faced with an existential threat that should have this sort of galvanizing effect and unifying effect on America. But right now that's not happening. And I'm struggling to understand why.
Yeah. Right. When I go downtown to
was
Minneapolis,
that a question? because we ask the questions here.
Yep. I have some working hypotheses, but I have three very smart people here. I'd be curious what you think.
Yeah. Listen, James is about to wrap it up because your staff is the problem here. Your staff told us we could have you for only so and so many minutes.
I'm happy to go a little bit longer.
I just want you to know that I sleep well at night knowing that your co-chairman Angus King is a Dartmouth man.
Well, his claim to fame is that he's married to a Packers fan. So, he has good judgment.
Okay.
Congressman, what if we're watching or reading the news, how will we know? I mean, to the extent, or what will be our signs that as a country, as a government, sort of as a national security apparatus, we're starting to take this more seriously?
That is a great question. I think my view is that you really have to think about what's different in cyber, which, as I alluded to before, so much of this competition is happening in the private sector.
Right.
So I think for your average American, it's not going to be, oh, hey, the Defense Department appointed an assistant secretary for cyber, or the national cyber director did this or that. It's going to be your company, medium, small size manufacturing company in Northeast Wisconsin, is really, as a cultural matter, starting to prioritize this. Simple things, right? Like two-factor authentication and basic cyber hygiene. Right. When it permeates down to the level of, as a daily habit, we're all doing cyber hygiene. That's when I think we're starting to get on the right track, if that makes sense. Okay, that makes sense. That's yeah. That and smoke starts to emerge from like Putin's dacha somewhere, and James's wish will have been fulfilled.
Indeed it will. I can't wait for the satellite
or
photos.
if I disappear, please promise me you'll investigate my disappearance.
Well, not
yeah. Won't accept the official explanation.
Oh no. We know I know exactly where to find you. We'll find you in the warehouse district of Minneapolis, Minnesota, gazing up at the beautiful tall towers and saying, "Why haven't I been here before?" I even embrace the beauty of their stadium, the climate, the culture, the people, the sophistication. I never want to eat cheese again unless it's from these wonderful stores that I have here at Lunds and Byerly's. Yeah, we'll know when it's done, when we don't hear anything, when there's no Colonial Pipeline, when there's no electrical grid that goes down, when everything runs as we expect it to do, we will know that you guys are on the case. And, I feel a lot better about going forward, having talked to you about this too. Just do not pass any sort of mandatory screensaver act, would you? Something that everybody's required to have don't click on that dodgy letter, that has a little fish hook with it, some little graphic that says you're being set up. As long as we don't have a national standard for warning screensavers like we have at the office, that'll be great.
Oh, wow. I'll play defense on that.
Okay. All right.
Unlike the Vikings, I will play defense on that.
That's good. Good choice. Good choice.
One last kick in the shin before he goes.
Yeah,
and we'll still have him back at the earliest possible opportunity. Can't wait to see you on Uncommon Knowledge, which I'm sure is coming up soon.
Never got invited. Never got invited.
Yeah, well,
yeah.
This audition was a little rough, I have to say.
Yeah.
Mike Gallagher, Representative Mike Gallagher. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Congressman.
Today.
Thank
we hope
you,
to have
guys.
you back soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mike.